The Placer County Jane Doe, identified as Donna Lass. On September 6, 1970, a 25-year-old registered nurse named Donna Lass was working at a first aid station at the Sahara Hotel and Casino in Lake Tahoe. Donna had a logbook that she needed to use for her job, and her last entry would happen at 1:50 a.m. Then she just seemingly disappeared. It's not even clear if she finished her shift or not. We do know, though, that her car was parked near her apartment building, and this was located in State Line, Nevada. This is about a 7-minute drive away from the hotel where she worked. But the weird thing is, no one saw her leave the casino, and no one actually knows how her car got to where it was or who was driving it. I know sometimes cameras seem intrusive, but in a case like this, had they existed at the time, it probably would have made all the difference. Donna was a responsible woman who was pretty reliable, and her family states that she would not have walked away. So they just had to keep looking for her, and they had no idea where she could be. Witnesses placed a blonde man speaking with her near the apartment that she had rented one day earlier. They would say the man appeared to be pretty young. All her personal belongings, besides the clothes she wore that night and her purse, were located inside of her new apartment. She had money in the bank, and this was never touched again. She also had a very large wardrobe, and all of it was left behind. The following day, an unknown male would place a phone call to both Donna's landlord and to her employer to tell them that Donna had a family emergency, someone in her family was ill, and she would not be returning. Her family would make it clear they made no such call, and there was no such emergency. So, as far as they were concerned, it was obvious something had happened to Donna. No one knows who the man was who called, if he was the man who was spotted with her, or even if that witness was correct in seeing Donna with somebody. After all, Donna had just moved there for one day, so they probably didn't recognize her by sight. And then a postcard would be received at the San Francisco Chronicle, and the person claiming to be the Zodiac. And of course, in that case, the Zodiac has never been identified. The postcard would have an image of the Tahoe area with his signature crosshairs mark on it. On it also were the phrases, "Sought Victim 12" and "Peek Through the Pines." By this time, there were legitimate postcards that were being sent to the Chronicle, but it's possible this specific card was an imposter, maybe meant to throw off investigators. It appears the card was never authenticated. A seemingly unrelated event would take place in Placer County, California, on August 5, 1986, and at this time a skull was found near Interstate 80 in Placer County. They found nothing else in that spot, no clothing or anything else remained. Maybe I've covered too many of these, but I always wonder how many people are along the highway that haven't been found. And in this case, they would discover years later that those remains had probably been there for 16 years when they were found in 1986. 37 more years would pass until Othram Labs would discover that the skull found so long before belonged to Donna. There's no question Donna was missed so much by her family and friends, and they would describe her as a successful young woman graduating in 1962 from a high school in South Dakota. Donna had been inspired to be a nurse since she was a high school student. Following her dream, she would graduate from college as an RN. Her family had hoped that she was still alive, and in fact, she would be listed as a survivor in the 1973 obituary of her father. However, by the time her mother had passed in 1982, her obituary would list Donna as no longer being living. Neither parent learned of her fate in time. It appears now that the link to the Zodiac case is no longer being considered as accurate, and they still have no idea who did this to Donna. They can't even get a COD. The odds of finding the person are probably pretty poor, but the police really need someone to come forward if there's any chance it will happen. Anyone with any information can contact the South Lake Tahoe detectives at the number given on the screen. Donna Ann Lass was missing for 53 years and an unidentified Jane Doe for 37. She was found 109 miles or 175 kilometers from home. Had she lived, she would be 78 years old today. The Superior Township Jane Doe, identified as Cheryl Lynne Coates. This story begins in Superior Township, Michigan in January 1985, when remains were found in a shallow grave. The woman was buried near the Woolman Oval Apartments, which were abandoned in the 1970s, and they've since been torn down. The police quickly determined they belonged to a woman who was likely near legal age, upwards to the age of 25. She was wearing a winter coat. She was probably about 5'1" or 155 centimeters and around 105 pounds or 48 kilograms. She had on 2 sweaters and a heavy winter coat, as well as size 4 jeans. She'd likely been there only a few months before she was found. They believe she passed probably between January of 1984 and January of 1985. Her COD was identified as being a wound. They would begin to circulate a forensic sketch that depicted what she may have looked like, and they would enter her into NamUs in hopes that someone missing her would see her listed as being found. I was unable to locate the forensic sketch, however, it wasn't the only depiction that was done. It would not be until Othram Labs became involved that they would find her cousin, and then they finally had answers, and Cheryl Lynn Coates was officially found. Cheryl was just 25 and had been living in either Southfield or the Detroit area of Michigan when her life was taken. She was known to spend time in both areas. The fact that she had on multiple clothing items made the police believe she may have been homeless at the time. However, the police really need someone to come forward to explain what her circumstances were at the time to try to figure out who did this. Her mother, Meta Waller, passed away in the attacks on September 11, 2001. She was sitting at her desk in the Pentagon when a jet struck the building. It was her cousin's DNA in that case that would identify our Jane Doe's mom. That same cousin would help identify Cheryl Lynn. She would go on to say how shocked she was to learn that Cheryl had been gone all of that time, stuck in limbo as a Jane Doe since 1985, saying, "I just think of all the time we've been wondering what happened. Where is she? Is she alive?" She would say they come from a storied family. Her great-grandmother, who Cheryl's mother was named after, was Meta Warwick Fuller, who was a famous African-American sculptor. Their great-grandfather, Dr. Simon Carter Fuller, was actually the first African-American psychiatrist in the United States. Meta herself would become the special programs manager for the administrative assistant to the Secretary of the Army at the Pentagon. The thing that mattered to her mom the most was what happened to Cheryl. She would say her mother especially never got over it, and the most disheartening thing was discovering that Cheryl had been found where she went missing. She would say she was right here all of the time, saying she lives only 15 minutes away now from the wooded area where Cheryl was found. They do ask that anyone who knows anything about this case call the county tip line at 734-973-7711. It's obviously not enough just to give her name. She deserves justice also. Cheryl Lynn Coates went unidentified for 38 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 63 years old today. The West Palm John Doe, January 1985. Identified as Terry Ketron. We begin today in Lake Worth, Florida, in a wooded area near Pine Grove Stables, and this was on January 13, 1985. This is addressed in some articles as West Palm Beach, Florida. Children were out playing in a wooded area where they discovered what ended up being a shallow grave. This was near what is described as the LS9 Canal. The kids ran back and told their parents, who in turn would call the police. They would estimate the man had been there for 4 or 5 years. His COD was clear. He'd been hit by what was described as a blast to the chest, and pellets were still found underneath him. The fact that pellets were found below him indicate this happened in the spot where he was found, as if someone took him out in the woods, dug a hole of 16 inches, and then did what was done. There was damage to the man's shoulder, and they were able to tell that he'd been pretty muscular in life. He had broad shoulders, and he'd had his nose, brow, back, and hand all fractured at one point. He'd also had extensive dental work done. It would take Othram Labs to even find his name. Terry Ketron was 31 when he left his home in Campbell County, Kentucky, in the early 1980s. His family at the time had no idea they'd never see him again. He was traveling to Florida with a woman named either Connie or Bonnie to visit her family. He would phone home once from the trip saying it wasn't going well. He would explain that he was having problems with both his new girlfriend and her family, and this would be the last time they heard from him. The woman they are looking for, Connie or Bonnie, is seen here. They need her to be identified so that she can be questioned. Of course, it doesn't help either that Terry was 1,045 miles or 1,682 kilometers from his home in Kentucky. That distance always makes things much harder when it comes to identification. The girlfriend so far is the best lead. Please call the number on the screen if you have any idea what happened. Terry Ketron was missing for 43 years, and he was an unidentified John Doe for 38. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 74 years old today. The King County Jane Doe, also known as Jane Doe B-17 or Bones 17, identified as Lori Ann Razpotnik, and the King County Jane Doe, also known as Jane Doe B-20 or Bones 20, identified as Tammie Charlene Liles. We actually have two identifications today that came from the same source. When I began my research on this identification, it was just Bones 17, and it was the second to the last remaining identification of the Jane Does for the Green River serial cases. I'd planned to cover the remaining Jane Doe in hopes she would be identified, but then something sort of surprising happened. As I came back to write this up, it turned out the other remaining Doe was identified also, which is obviously amazing. So that always comes down to whether we want it to be about the women or the monster that did it. So I'm going to just try to do a recap as to what happened. And if someone wants a deep dive, there are really great videos out there that you can watch. So this began on July 15th, 1982, when the first woman was found by children who were walking along Seattle, Washington's Green River. It was at this time that they saw her along the inside of the bank. It's always really chilling when it's kids that find the people, and unfortunately it happens a lot. So many people are touched by every single event. And in this case, the first woman was identified as Wendy Caulfield. What Seattle didn't know at the time was that something was just beginning. It would terrify the city and captivate the whole nation for years to come. Within 2 months of Wendy being found, 5 more women would be discovered in the same general area. The particular monster in this case was choosing to target women who were working the streets to get by, and a lot of these women had kids that were left behind. The first victim, Wendy Caulfield, wasn't even fully an adult yet. She went missing from a foster home. And it would turn out that many of these women were around the same age. While the numbers grew fast, they would lessen in frequency over time, but it didn't stop. The task force for the Green River cases would be put together, disbanded, and put together again when new information would come out. They followed every lead they could, but nothing led to who did this. I guess that's not true. I should say it didn't lead to the person who did this for a very long time, but it would turn out he was a suspect early on. The final confirmed case was a woman found in 1998, and by then the confirmed cases were 49, but it's believed there are probably more people missing that just haven't been physically tied into the others. DNA would finally pinpoint and cause Gary Ridgway to be identified as the monster. And he was a suspect early on, as I said. He'd been seen actually with 2 of the women right before they disappeared. He was first interviewed on April 30th, 1983, but he passed the lie detector test they gave him, and then they moved on. However, questions lingered about him. He would actually donate a DNA sample in 1987. However, science hadn't caught up enough yet, obviously, by then. However, by 2001, things changed, and this would end up being the downfall of Gary Ridgway. They would eventually be able to prove that Gary Ridgway was the perpetrator. It's just unfortunate that didn't happen much earlier. So many women's lives were at risk. Wendy Stevens, seen here, was the last Jane Doe to be identified in 2021, with the exception of the 2 Jane Does we have here today. So this takes us to the King County Jane Doe B-17 or Bones 17, identified as Lori Ann Razpotnik. Her story begins in 1985 on a steep embankment in Auburn, Washington. And they too would find themselves reduced to the name of Bones 16 and Bones 17. Bones 16 was a black woman and Bones 17 was a white woman, but both were of similar age. Sandra Major, formerly known as Bones 16, went unidentified for 26 years. She was identified in 2012. She was from Auburn, Washington, and was just 20 when her life was taken. She was actually identified when her cousin watched a Green River documentary. She began to believe that her missing cousin was the Jane Doe, and she was right. This would leave 2 more unsolved Jane Does for over a decade. A woman named Donna Hurley had just arrived at her home in Juneau, Alaska, when 2 King County Sheriff's detectives showed up at her door. I'm sure it was pretty alarming, detectives from another state asking to speak to her. Those detectives would begin to explain that they were working on a set of remains known as Bones 17, that this was part of the Green River cases. They would explain to Donna that they believed that Bones 17 was her daughter. Lori Ann disappeared in 1982, 3 years shy of being an adult, with the age shown on the screen here. Her mother was shocked and explained how vibrant her daughter was. She would say that she's pure joy and a firecracker, and she lived her life doing everything 100%. She said her fuse was lit and she would look for a place to explode every day, be it baseball, protecting her brother, doing dog shows, horseback riding, or even riding a motorcycle. She threw herself into everything that she did, and she was really good at all of it. She was a straight-A student. 4 decades earlier, when Lori ran away, she was going through an awkward stage in her life, and she had been struggling a lot. Her mother didn't give up looking for her, though. She had hired a private investigator, and that man would warn her that Lori would be hard to find if she didn't want that to happen, saying that young women change their names and their looks easily. And this may have been even more true back in the 80s, when there were choices of rocking a perm or frosted hair that changed your color completely. And of course, the usual hair dye. He probably had a point, but things were not really what they seemed. And obviously, he found no trace of her. It doesn't specifically say she was reported missing. However, given she hired a private investigator, I'd say there's probably a pretty good chance she did report her missing too. The investigator looked and looked for her daughter, although he did warn her that if she didn't want to come home, there was nothing that he could do. Over the years, she resorted to looking for her daughter on TV. Although it doesn't specifically say, I think maybe this means in documentaries, because she did say that she looked at the Green River case before as a documentary. But she unfortunately didn't see Lori in Lori's recreation, and she actually breathed a sigh of relief that her daughter wasn't one of them. So Donna would try to come to terms with her daughter being missing. She would suffer for the next 4 decades, not knowing what happened. She explained that she would imagine that Lori was happy and healthy, living a good life with children, and that one day she would decide to contact her. And this was something she was hanging on to. Donna would provide her saliva to be tested at Parabon Nanolabs. And with this, once again, Lori would have her name. And maybe more importantly in this case, Donna would finally have an answer. It was one that she feared and didn't want, but probably needed to hear anyway. Donna would ask the detectives how they even found her. And she was told that genetic genealogy was used and her granddaughter had uploaded her own DNA to 23andMe and then added it to the public database. This would eventually lead to Lori's mother. She said it was very overwhelming and very shocking. In the time since Lori passed, so has her brother. When Lori's grandparents passed, they asked Donna to never forget and to try to bring her home. Donna is actually the last surviving member of her family who met and knew Lori and who loved her. They said that Lori will be buried next to her father in Seattle. Lori Ann Razpotnik went unidentified for 39 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 54 years old today. The King County Jane Doe, also known as Jane Doe B20 or Bones 20, identified as Tammie Charlene Liles. This one is a little bit different from the prior case in how she was found. In fact, the woman known as Bones 20 wasn't even found until 2003. She was in an area that was described as a dumping ground for cases related to the Green River. She was found in an area adjacent to Kent Des Moines Road in Kent, Washington, and this is located south of Seattle. Our Jane Doe here was actually found because Ridgway confessed, and he would lead them to the area telling them where to look. Unfortunately, his memory was not strong for these cases, and if he knew her name, he didn't know it anymore. All they could really tell was that she was female and in the similar age group as the others. There wasn't even any clothing or any items found with her. They estimated she'd passed between 1970 and 1990, which obviously doesn't help narrow it down. It certainly didn't help that the remains were partial, and because there was no skull, there was no way to do a recreation. Although we know now there's a reason the skull wasn't there. It hadn't ever actually been there. Her other remains were found on a golf course near Tigard, Oregon, on April 23, 1985. I remember thinking the name Tammie Liles looked familiar. It turns out that Tammie was identified twice. This was done through her dental records in 1988, 3 years after she was found. I would love to know why she was in 2 different places. He didn't do this with the others, or at least that I'm aware of right now. Thankfully, her dental records gave her parents an answer much earlier than the Jane Doe in the case that I mentioned prior. Tammie's original remains were found near that of Angela Girdner, who was identified in 2009. Tammie was reported missing shortly before she was identified. It kind of plays into why monsters like Ridgway end up choosing the people that they do. A lot of these women had problems with their families. Many didn't have anyone else to fall back on. But for those who did have family, like Tammie, it's hard to know when you can even report them missing, because in a way they're already missing, if that makes sense. If they're out on their own and not really in contact for whatever reason. And then, of course, sometimes the families try to report them missing and they're not able to. It just depends on the jurisdiction. And it does sort of seem like the busier jurisdictions are the ones less likely, or at least at the time, to take a report. Of the 10 Gilgo Beach women that I covered on that case, only one wasn't reported missing, or at least tried to, by their family, because the police would say they were missing by choice, saying that they have a right not to contact their families if they want to. And I'm sure in some cases that is the truth of what happened. However, for the Gilgo women, it's why they didn't get identified either. And in part, it was because their lives were unstable and they worked as escorts. And I'm not saying that the police feel they didn't matter, or even were dismissing them due to their occupation, but in part because stability isn't always a part of the equation. So in the case of Ridgway, these women were more at risk and probably far more likely to go unidentified at the time. But unfortunately, it's a situation that people like Ridgway take to their advantage. But the very situation itself in this case made it so hard for the police to even try to solve it. This was something they spent thousands of hours trying to find answers for. Thankfully, the DNA Doe Project would take on the case of Bones 20, and it would be them who discovered that Tammie Liles had been found. Again. We know now she was just 1 year older than Lori, and the age can be seen here on the screen. The Liles family has dealt with a lot. The sad thing about this, too, is Tammie Liles' family is now going through the loss sort of all over again. The crazy thing about this is Tammie Liles' family was hurt because Gary Ridgway never admitted to Tammie being one of his, although he would actually plead guilty for it, but he would deny her. However, the first group of Tammie's remains, when she was originally identified, were found with a woman named Angela Girdner in an area where previous known cases were tied to Ridgway. However, Ridgway would insist he did not hurt either of these women. And when he pled guilty later, he refused to admit to them. In 2003, Tammie's brother spoke out about how much that hurt her family. Sadly, the proof wouldn't come until 2024, when the rest of her remains were identified, again near other known victims. There's just no question that Ridgway was responsible. So while Tammie was listed officially as a victim, Angela so far has not been. Tammie's brother stated in 2003 that you live with this for 20 years, wondering what happened, and despite that, you feel like you can't ever find closure, saying that if he would just admit he did it, it would have helped the family a lot. And that's really sad. Hopefully Tammie's family's doing better in finding some sort of closure, however late it came. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, it's believed that 70 women would perish due to the twisted desires of this specific monster. He was charged and convicted of 49 cases, but he's confessed to 71. He is currently incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. Some of Tammie Charlene Liles' remains went missing for 40 years, and she was an unidentified Jane Doe for 20. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 56 years old today. The Carrollton, Kentucky John Doe, identified as Kenneth Linville. We begin in this case on September 1st, 1980, in Carrollton, Kentucky. Floodwaters had receded on the Ohio River near the town of Carrollton. It was here the remains of a person were found on a riverbank, but they were incomplete and skeletal. It would take over 2 months, and on November 11th, 1980, more remains were actually found on the riverbank behind the Kentucky Utilities Plant in Ghent, Kentucky. This is approximately 7 miles or 11 kilometers from where the first remains were found. They had no way at the time of proving they belonged to one person, although they long suspected that they did. Finally, in 2005, they were able to do DNA on both of the remains, confirming they were in fact one man. However, they still had no idea who the man was, even after a reconstruction was done. In May of 2017, a tip would come in that suggested the remains were that of a missing constable named George Hawkins. George disappeared years earlier in 1961, and it's believed it was related to the mob. And the tip that would come in would say the reconstruction had a really close resemblance to George Hawkins. And if you look at the photos here, it's really easy to see why that conclusion was made. 4 days after George went missing, his vehicle had been found parked at the edge of a river in Dayton, Kentucky. His keys were left in the ignition, so it's possible someone dumped the vehicle and hoped that it would be stolen, and the vehicle was a red herring. George has never been found, and there were whispers that he was doing business with the mob, and his disappearance was retaliation. So they thought they may have George, but they still needed to do genetic genealogy. And in came Othram Labs, who got their funding through Project Justice. It was concluded on December 23, 2023, that the man actually wasn't George Hawkins. Instead, it was Kenneth Linville, who was 40 when he went missing from Bethel, Ohio. Bethel is about 81 miles or 130 kilometers from where he was found, in Carrollton, Kentucky. So this was about an hour-and-a-half drive away. He was actually missing less than 2 weeks before he was found. We know now that Mr. Linville had spent many years going in and out of psychiatric institutions. He was admitted to a psych hospital on at least 6 occasions. I always feel like mental health is so important, and if there's anything I can add, I want to do that. I actually wrote a research paper in college on deinstitutionalization, which in 1950s, a major shift happened. They used to pretty much just put mentally ill people in a hospital, and they were often pretty awful places. But with new medications and new treatment, there was better outlook, and they basically just let people out of the institutions. Many of these people weren't prepared for being on their own, and it just created a rotating door of people going in and out. And since then, we seem to have more options, but less funding. And in this case, Ken was last discharged on August 22nd, 1980, and this was less than 2 weeks before he was found. No COD was able to be determined. We keep cutting funds for mental health support, and it just sets people up for failure. I was doing outreach at a homeless shelter, and this was in maybe 1996, 1997. In this case, she was schizophrenic, and I had found her sitting outside, shaking because she believed people were trying to hurt her. So I picked her up, took her to the local mental health center, and it was decided by the crisis therapist that she needed to end up in the hospital. So, long story short, I had to call the managed mental health care plan and beg them to let her be put into the hospital. Now, mind you, I have all these professionals behind me agreeing this needs to happen. However, the company, at least in my state, was given a pool of money and they get to keep it if they don't use it all up. And they refused to allow her to be hospitalized. They said she wasn't a danger to herself or others. She was very much not doing okay. And by now, I'm maybe 4 hours in. I had canceled everything and was trying to get this taken care of. Waiting for callbacks, doing what I needed to. I tried to get her into the group home. She was too sick for the group home. They wouldn't take her because they said she was a danger to the other people because of how ill she was and what was going on. So she was not ill enough for the hospital, too sick for the group home, and a danger to others there. It's absolutely ridiculous. I was almost in tears, honestly. This poor woman, I was able to do nothing for her. I even went back to the homeless shelter and called and spoke to her family in another state. There was absolutely nothing that I could do for her. And the job I had as a case manager doesn't exist anymore because a bunch of mental health funds were cut in 2017 in order to balance a budget off of some tax cuts. And this isn't about politics in any way, shape, or form. What it's about is people, and it's something that is really important to keep in mind because things are not going to get better until we decide to treat the mental health needs of people in our communities. I wish I knew more about Kenneth's life, though in a way I feel like I know him already. And sadly, even though this happened to Kenneth in 1980, it's probably still happening today. Kenneth Linville went unidentified for 43 years. Had he lived, he would be 83 years old today. The Rhinelander John Doe, also known as the Oneida County John Doe, identified as Norman John Christopher Guessler. This case starts on March 19, 1980, in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. A man went for a walk behind his property located along Highway 17 North, and it was here a man was found in a field who had likely passed from exposure due to hypothermia. He did have some visible trauma to his head. They believe that his clothing may have worked against him in the cold weather of Wisconsin. He had on black Oxford shoes that were slick at the bottom, likely leading to him slipping and falling on the frozen ground. And they think that's possible where the trauma to his head came from. None of his clothing were suited to the weather that he would have encountered at the time. They believed he came from what they describe as sugar camp, traveling by foot from Rhinelander, though they never found evidence of this or his name. As an outsider, that sounds like an actual camp, perhaps for area workers, which I'll admit I did think when I first read this. But this is actually a city. If he was making that trek, that's about a 13-mile walk or 21 kilometers, which would have been pretty brutal in what he was wearing. I pulled the weather for a few days the month prior to when he was found, as he'd been there for a while. And the weather looks like it was in the 20s and 30s Fahrenheit, or at best -7 or around 0 Celsius. That's a long walk in pretty cold temperatures. It's believed that whatever happened was accidental. His hair was gray and he had a receding hairline. He had likely worn glasses based on the marks that were on his nose, but none were found. He wore a size 12 shoe. He did have on brown fur earmuffs, which obviously may have helped some with the cold. Based on his clothing, they didn't believe probably planned to walk a far distance, so perhaps something happened. However, he did have with him a compass, so it's possible it was part of the plan. He also had with him a comb and a pink card celebrating the 89th anniversary of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. That would probably be the best clue they had as to who he was, and they were thinking he was perhaps one of those electrical workers, as his clothing appeared to be expensive. He was wearing a white metal Helbros Invincible wristwatch. And according to the article I read, these watches at the time were considered to be extremely expensive. There were 2 loose keys inside of his pockets. And because he had a calendar with him, they thought perhaps he was working a job as an electrician in the area. Thanks to Ramapo College, our John Doe was identified as Norman John Christopher Guessler. He would have been only 31 when he passed away in 1980. He had disappeared 2 months prior to being found. And in fact, he'd been reported missing at the time, on January 20th, 1980. His mother passed away in 1988 without ever knowing what Norm's fate was. His father would pass in 2001. Norm was found 340 miles or 547 kilometers from where he was last seen. Norman Guessler went unidentified for 43 years. Had he lived, he would be 75 years old today. The Daviess County John Doe, identified as Wilbur Allen Grant. The story begins in May of 2016, when a woman and a man were found close to each other on the Ohio River in Daviess County, Kentucky. The river in question forms a boundary between Kentucky and Indiana. The woman was white and appeared to be younger than the black male. The woman was identified quickly as Sarah Lindsay Ipock, who is either 29 or 30 years old, depending on which source I looked at. But the man they could not identify, and Sarah's family had no idea who he was. In fact, they weren't even sure that Sarah knew the man. Because both were found on the same day and so close together, the assumption was made that they were probably linked in some way, if not just a link to whoever did this, one person being responsible for both. Sarah was found first, and our John Doe was located a few hours later near the Evansville Marine boat ramp. Since no one could identify him, all they could do was try to get fingerprints. But then that didn't work. He'd been in the water too long. They would say that both cases were clearly foul play, but the COD was different. Sarah's COD is seen on the screen now via me showing an article that was written on the topic. I'm not sure how to sanitize that correctly for YouTube, and I don't want to take any risks. I would love to know what you think about both cases being related. Other than where they were found, there was quite a few differences. Our John Doe was older than Sarah, and there were signs that someone tried to asphyxiate him, leaving marks on his neck, but the COD was actually a wound to the back of his head. I wavered back and forth between using the recreation. It shows up on Unidentified Wiki, and I'm not seeing it anywhere else, or at least at the time when I wrote this up. I'll leave a note on the screen if I figure anything more out as I'm syncing this video together, but however, I don't see race listed at all in these newspaper articles, and this makes me think they couldn't tell his race because of the condition of his body. Unfortunately, they pull the NamUs file down when they identify the person, but it does look from that one picture, if it's on the wiki by mistake, a misidentification for race would probably make a big difference too. They thought maybe Sarah's life was the best clue, or maybe the only clue they had at the time, and the press reported that she'd been in and out of the criminal justice system in both Indiana and Kentucky. The only charge listed was burglary, but it suggested it was this or similar activities in both states. I'm not seeing any reference, though, to illegal substances or anything like that. Sarah did have some outstanding warrants when she passed, though I'm not sure what they were. The police made a comment at the time to reporters that if she was involved in criminal activity, it might make it more difficult to gather information because the police they need to speak to tend to not want to speak to the police. At the time, the sheriff's office did say anyone with information on her hopefully will identify him. But unfortunately, nothing happened, and it does appear there was maybe a misidentification as far as race. They did note that he had a scar and what's described as a fixation device near the outer edge of his eyebrow. The device was described as pins and a steel plate. His pants were size 33 by 32. It would take 7 years and DNA for Othram Labs to finally get his name through genetic genealogy. Wilbur Allen Grant was 55 when his life was taken. He went missing from Louisville, Kentucky, about 110 miles or 177 kilometers from where he was found. Wilbur's family reported him missing when he stopped answering his phone. If anyone has any information on who took his life or who took Sarah's life, they really need someone to come forward. Sarah, for her part, left behind 4 children and would have been 36 years old today. Both deserve justice. Please call the number on the screen if you have any information on this case. Wilbur Allen Grant went unidentified for 7 years. Had he lived, he would be 62 years old today. The Amethyst Jane Doe, also known as McLean, Texas Jane Doe, identified as Brenda Sue Guessler. A crew was out mowing the grass on the outskirts of McLean, Texas on August 12, 1999, and it was then that a woman was found hidden by weeds a mile west of the intersection of Highway 273 and Route 66. Those examining her would nickname her Amethyst Doe for the rings that she had on. Her COD was never able to even be determined, and it's possible there was foul play, but we just don't know at this time. She had brownish blonde hair and an underdeveloped right tibia and fibula, and they believe this could have been caused by polio. Her right ankle and leg had been fused with a surgical screw. They believe this likely would have caused her to limp. She had a small mouth, and 4 bottom teeth were missing. They believe she'd given birth to at least 1 child. She had some rings with clear and red stones in them that can be seen here. Her age was placed at 33 to 45 or 35 to 60, depending on the source that I looked at. This is another one that Roads to Justice funded through Othram Labs. It's sad how much we don't know about Brenda, and this always comes with the police wanting someone to come forward. I don't even have her actual age. Maybe by the time I'm able to finalize this, I will, but it's still listed as 35 to 60. I considered not showing the case, but she deserves justice, and so that's not fair either. So please call the number on the screen if you have any information on what was going on in her life. We know she'd vanished from Phoenix, which is 814 miles or 1,320 kilometers from where she was found in McLean, Texas. That alone is odd. They don't know how she got there. Brenda Sue Guessler went unidentified for 22 years. The Conroe Lake John Doe, also known as the Conroe John Doe, identified as Clarence Wilson. Today's case is a case I actually covered as an unidentified doe. It's always somewhat satisfying and a huge relief even to find that they've been identified. I'm not going to rerun this one, however, because there's music in the background And I found out later that it overruns some people if they're listening in headphones. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown about what had happened. If you're interested in that video, I'll put a link in the video here below. Our John Doe was found in Crater Lake in Conroe, Texas on August 3rd, 1986. Crater Lake isn't some huge fancy lake at all. Instead, it's described as a muddy area that was actually formed when an oil well exploded in 1983, leaving behind a crater that is now filled with water. And this is actually how it became a lake. So people were walking around this lake when they observed what appeared to be a person in the water. The fire department and deputies would arrive, heading out to the lake for what was anticipated to be an accidental event. However, it really wasn't. Our John Doe had been weighed down with 2 cement cinder blocks. His COD was due to multiple wounds. A tip would eventually come in saying they believed he was an area man who used to go by the name New York Billy. The only identifiable details about his case was that he had 3 tattoos that are noted as not being very well done. One said Baby Dawn, another said Liz, and a third was of a small devil with a painted tail. They believed the man was likely 20 to 35 years old. They eventually exhumed him in 2015 to get his DNA and to also do a reconstruction. They'd hoped for more tips, but none came in, at least none that would pan out. And they would find themselves doing this all over again this last year. The original DNA that they got is the old kind that you'll see where they say DNA available. The type they use for genetic genealogy is a lot more complicated. And that, unfortunately, required a brand new sample. And it was with this they would learn our John Doe was in fact a man missing from Texas City, Texas, named Clarence Wilson. He was only 86 miles or 138 kilometers from home. There's no indication he was ever called New York Billy. He did, however, have a sister who was missing him and needed to know what happened. It would turn out she went all these years thinking he'd chosen not to contact her. She was interviewed by Fox 26 Houston.
I think because of the brutality of the whole thing, I think that was the hardest part.
His sister Gwen Tranum in California says her family looked for him for years.
He's out there somewhere in Texas, and if he wants to notify us, he will.
She got notification, but not from Wilson. It was from Detective Fatty Risk.
And he asked me if I would submit a DNA because he was working a cold case, a murder cold case.
With old news, but a new sample, they found Gwen.
He called me and notified me that it was a positive match.
Wilson was found weighted down to the bottom of Crater Lake here in 1986. But just learning the news, his sister is struggling with it like it just happened yesterday.
Clarence Williams went unidentified for 37 years. Had he lived, he would be 72 years old today. I will leave you with his sister's words.
If you know something, just come forward and tell what you know, and maybe they can find this person, and have closure.
The Millard County John Doe, identified as Robert Holman Trent. This case begins in Kenosha, Utah, in 1958. The crazy thing about this one, there's documentation showing that the remains were found in 1958. However, weirdly enough, it also shows that they weren't ever given to the Utah State Medical Examiner until May of 1979. There's no remaining record of who found them or how and why this even happened. Paper records, of course, have a way of going missing over time, and a lot of time has passed. His COD was never able to be determined. This is one of those that is maybe even more sad about the family than the man, because quite a few people were left behind and passed without ever even knowing his bones had been found 65 years earlier. We know now, of course, that they belonged to a man who his family didn't even know was in Utah. What I appreciate about this is that Millard County still pushed ahead to identify him, even though this had happened so long ago, and his immediate family was likely gone. Robert Holman Trent was 45 in 1958 when he went missing from Reidsville, North Carolina, which is 2,116 miles or 3,405 kilometers away. In 2010, the state medical examiner took another crack at this case, saying they believed he was likely a working cowboy or a rodeo athlete, and that the man may have been knock-kneed. an American artist and poet, went missing in the deserts of Utah in the 1930s, and they thought in this case that they may have finally found the missing man, Everett Roos. In a way, his being identified finally is a bit of a miracle, given he came from a world where DNA wasn't an option and his bones weren't examined until 21 years after they were found. Because they estimated he was 25 to 35, they were also off by a decade. Although he was found so far away, the odds of a match being found with an accurate age probably isn't any better. Robert Holman Trent was born on January 15, 1913. He had a child named James that was born in 1940. It's possible his son is still alive, and he would be 83 years old today. Robert's father passed in 1957, 1 year before his remains were even found, and his mother had already passed in 1921. Hopefully, finally knowing what happened to Robert was in time to bring peace to someone who was missing him. Robert Trent went unidentified for 65 years. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.